Hi guys, my name is Professor Sternberg and today I'm going to talk to you about ink. So first I just want to mention the materials that you are going to need in order to make drawings with ink. First you're going to need a bottle of ink. About this big of a bottle is enough. I didn't have black ink right now, but you would be buying a bottle of black ink. You would need a few containers. They could be just any kind of small containers. Here I have an assortment of different types. Even you could probably cut off part of a bottle like this. So anything small, you would need at least 3 containers, maybe 4 or 5, to mix different shades of ink to help you at the beginning to be able to control different values. You're going to need some materials to draw with. So here we have bamboo brushes, just like that. I also have some handmade materials. I'll talk about it in a minute. You can also use sticks or pens with a point to demonstrate on different kinds of papers, so you could see how differently it goes on different papers. So this is drawing paper, basic drawing paper. It's smooth. Here I also have some inexpensive watercolor paper. You could see the texture, but it's very subtle because it's a student grade, very thin watercolor paper. I also brought some just printer paper. You will see what it does on printer paper. Here I have a book, a watercolor book. So I have both kind of smooth finish hot press watercolor as well as rough. This is called a grinding stone. I have 2 different kinds, like a square one like this and a bigger one. So I'm going to use the bigger one. And I'm going to pour a little bit of water onto it. And then I'm going to use the stick and grind the ink on the stone, allowing it to begin to mix with water. Ink was kind of simultaneously discovered in different countries a long time ago. It's believed that it was used in Egypt around 26th century BC. Chinese inks go back 3 or maybe even 4 millennia. Ink was also used in ancient Japan, as well as during the Roman times. Traditional Chinese method of making ink was to grind a mixture of glue, carbon black, lamp black, and bone black pigments with a pestle and mortar, and then pour it into a ceramic dish to dry. So in this part, I'm going to show you how to work with liquid ink that you would buy at the store, something like this. This is Higgins Black Magic. It's only about $4 for this bottle. Comes in a little bottle like this. You could shake it a little bit just to make sure the ink is mixed. When you take it out of the, when you pour it out of the container, the ink is going to be very concentrated. So here, I'll show you. It's purely black. It's a little bit too dark to work just by itself. You could see it's like pure black. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna mix some grays by putting some water into a container and adding just like a drop of ink into it. So I'm going to, here, show you. I'm gonna just take a little bit of ink and mix it in here with my water, and that's probably even a little too much. I tinted the water. So this is my tone. So that's pretty dark actually. So I'm gonna make one more that's even lighter than that. So I'm just gonna pour some water and add a tiny bit of ink to it. So let's see what this came out as. And this is a little bit lighter. Maybe I'm gonna make even one lighter one. So here I have another container. So maybe something like this. You could still see the water is transparent, but it has just a very subtle tint to it. I think I still have some ink on my brush. I'm gonna clean it out. And then I have this one has a value like that. You could barely see it, but it's enough to start your drawing. Right now I'm going to talk to you about some of the tools. So this bamboo brush right here is the most basic ink painting, ink drawing tool. So you want a nice full brush here to hold lots of ink, but also a brush that will make a beautiful point. So usually these bamboo brushes are like a little bit longer than typical soft watercolor brushes. However, you can use regular watercolor brushes, so something like this. Don't use very expensive brushes because the ink is a little bit harsh on the hairs. You have to make sure you clean it really well, but you can use regular soft watercolor brushes as well. These brushes right here, these are called liners or riggers. Of course, you can also use any kind of fun brushes, for example, like these for texture. And it's also useful to have a kind of flat watercolor wash brush. Obviously, you don't have to have one. And you can get really creative and make some of your own painting tools for ink. You can also use feathers or even any kind of a stick as an end. Here's one made with Q-tips, with rubber bands, with some feathers, and I'll show you all the different textures. Now, you want to hold your brush, or really any drawing tool, kind of lightly. You don't want to grip it. You don't want to hold it too tense. This brush we usually hold towards the end, and allow your wrist, allow your hand to be free and to be able to turn, so that when you're making a mark, your brush can easily turn in your fingers, but also your hand can turn, right? So you could make any kinds of marks. But you have this beautiful point, so you should be able to do fine work as well as some more expressive work. Wet your paper and bring the ink into wet paper with your brush, and this makes really soft, flowy marks that you can somewhat control, but also the water kind of leads the way here and creates marks that it wants to create as well. So it's kind of a fun and creative way to work with ink. Now we'll show you some of these handmade materials. All right, and last but not least is I'm going to show you sort of the wash brush. You can use either one of these, and you can use it to wet the paper, as I mentioned before, to paint into it, but you can also use it to create a ink wash, just like similar to watercolor, that is as smooth. You can also add water to it and make it flow. I'll just show you close-ups of the different textures we created. So this is with a wash brush that looks like this, right? And water and ink. These were all our handmade tools. The really odd kind of tools made from rubber bands and from feathers, and we created all of these kinds of textures. And these here are with a bamboo brush as well as a liner brush and just a little stick. So I sketched in a simple still life, and I'm going to show you how to start painting on it with my lightest value that I created. Let me check it. That's pretty good. That's maybe value number 2. And I'm starting actually with my darkest areas just to test my value. So here's a pear. I'm going to lay in just the shadow areas. The lights are going to stay unpainted. I'm not going to paint them. So I'm putting in the value. And then I want to use just a wet brush, just run a wet brush along the edge of the value that I put down if you want to soften the edges, if you don't want the edges to be hard like that. There's a little bit of value here. You can also add just a little bit more in here. I'm going to grind a little bit more ink. I personally prefer working with the freshly ground ink. There's some grapes, so again I'm going to go a little bit lighter. That's a little dark. And lay down the value in all the shadow areas. Use the wet brush to kind of soften it, but leave the highlight unpainted. I'm going to do the same for the other grapes. And here I'm adding a little bit more value while the grape is still wet. So it is important to practice leaving the white of the paper. Learning where to leave the white of the paper is one of the skills you need while working with ink. The other technique that's really important is called edge painting. So here's my pear, and the edge of this pear is actually light. However, the picture that's behind it does have some value. So I'm gonna wet it first, like that, with a very, very pale value, and then add a little bit more value to it so you could see how the pear begins to stand out against it. So it's like negative edge painting. I'm painting behind the object rather than painting the object itself. You can see I'm also creating that with the grapes because the edges of the grapes are going to be light. I'm also going to do the same thing with the edge of the picture. So right here, the edge of the picture is light. However, the space, the wall behind the picture is a little bit darker. So I'm going to create some value in the wall to give the form of the picture. And I'm going to blend this out. And my grapes are going to get darker. I just started very light. They are going to get darker, so they will kind of stand out in contrast to the gray background. I'm also going to give the tone to this side of the wall, allowing the handle of the picture to stand out a bit, as well as the edge of this, the back edge of the pear. I like wetting the paper first, especially for these bigger areas. and allowing the ink to flow this way. It creates kind of like a soft and graded kind of wash color that's unique to ink. It's unique to wet media, and so I really like to use it as part of my work. Maybe not everything would be drawn wet into wet, however, using it at least in some areas really adds a lot of the soft quality to your drawing. I'm going to add also a darker cast shadow, so you can see, even though I gave the value to this pear, but I'm going to make a darker a darker shadow underneath, and that's going to give that make this edge stand out. I think there's going to be a cast shadow here as well from the picture, and even from the grape. I'm going to come back and add some value to the grapes, leaving some of the highlights. Again, using a wet brush, you can soften that edge, making for a more rounded form. And you can also drop in a little bit stronger value in places, just to give, again, more roundness to the grapes. Or you can do it in another layer. So that's about the first layer. Maybe add a little bit of the branch. There's also a branch of the grapes here, and give a little bit more dimension to the handle. And there, so that's the first layer. I'm gonna let it dry. And now that this first layer is dry, I'm gonna come in with a second layer, intensifying some of the values and also kind of building a little bit more of the form. So for this drawing, I sketched in a portrait, and you want to make sure you move all your eraser marks off. And I'm going to show you a little bit of wet into wet, working with ink wet into wet. I'm going to just sort of wet all of my areas, or you can also wet just parts. And using my kind of middle value, I'm going to bring in some value into her face. Sometimes these brushes have loose hairs that you have to so you could see I'm working with marks, leaving out all the lights and just laying in the shadow areas of her skin and allowing the rest to just kind of float into the wet areas, into the water. Going to put in the shadow under the nose, the upper lip, the lower underneath the lip, underneath the chin, around her chin, by the side of the neck. Going to bring a little bit into her fingers if they're not wet anymore, so I'm going to add a little bit more water. Also her arm. What I like about drawing with ink into wet paper is the softness and the kind of emotional quality that it adds. Working with wet media, because of water, you always have this possibility to include this emotional quality that the flowing media has on paper. So hair is very interesting to work with. Certainly hair has texture, but hair also has its own body and form and kind of shadows and highlights that define that form. So for example, in this one, there's a highlight that goes all along the top here. So I'm going to lighten it up. And also up here, but then it gets a little bit darker along the parting of the hair. So you can accentuate that with a bit of shadow. So here the paper dried, and if you want to, you can kind of have a harder edge for the forehead. But I actually am going to make a softer edge because it's where the hair kind of falls over the head. So I'm just adding, just with a wet brush, I'm running through to just soften that line for now. And then I'm going to come in and continue to define some of the parts around the features. Those areas are starting to dry, so you could see that I can lay in some value without it running everywhere. However, underneath there's that soft shading that is still there. So again, I'm going to use the wet brush and run it through to soften some of those marks that I've placed down, because all I want to do is just bring in some stronger value, not necessarily make a line there. Also gonna bring some value underneath. And you can see I'm working with like a really big brush for such a small painting, just using the tip of the brush.
So when you're working with ink, try to build value slowly, layer by layer. Start with the lightest ink washes and gradually develop the value darker and darker. Allow the layers to dry in between. It's really important for you to practice mixing the right consistency of ink. Practice adding just enough water to make it flowing and transparent, but not too much water so that you can still have some control over the flow of your ink. It's really important to leave the light areas untouched, allowing the white of the paper to be the light of your drawing, to illuminate your drawing. You can always come back and add a light wash of ink in any of the white areas at the end of your drawing if you decide to make it darker. However, it's nearly impossible to lift the ink off the paper once it is dry. So again, work slowly and build your values step by step. And just like with any other media, drawing with ink becomes kind of an exercise in seeing and discovering different ways in which you can describe a form and share what you're seeing with others.
So just a quick overview of different ways you could use ink. With the brush, when you put down some value like that and you want to blend it into the white, what you do is just with the wet brush, actually I remove the water, some of the extra water, it's not dripping or anything like that, just a wet brush. If you run it along the edge of your value, you have to do it right away before it starts drying. You can see this one started to dry a little bit. You can begin to blend it. You can then also add a little bit more value as needed. So in this way, you can create gradations in ink. Let me mix some more ink and show it to you again, just a little bit quicker. So here, you put some value down. You can take a wet brush and begin to blend it, like so. And then you can add a little bit more the wet brush just to make the edge soft. So that makes that edge really, really soft. You can also add color or add ink back into the wet area to make things darker. You can also blend it out. Now you don't want to go back and forth like this too many times with ink. It just doesn't really seem to look great, kind of washes out the color a bit. So once you put the color down, you can move it around a little bit, but not too many times. Also, you can use a dry brush where you can drag the brush across your paper in any direction across and kind of pick up the texture, some of the texture of the paper. Of course, you could use the tip of your brush for line drawing, contour. Also, your line could be darker or lighter in some areas. Let me mix some more ink. It's a darker line. And the cool thing of making a line with a brush is that it can easily go from line to wider mark. So you can do quite a bit of kind of gestural drawing, especially when you're doing like figure drawing in life or landscape. And as I showed you before, you can wet the paper first and add the ink into the wet paper and allow it to spread and create all kinds of beautiful, beautiful transitions. You can work in layers also by adding ink into the areas that you have already put down. You can use any kinds of marks with your brush. Experiment with this. Spend some time just kind of getting to know your brush and seeing what marks do you like to make with it. Do you like to use the side of it? How to use water with ink. Really play with your material before you begin your project. So, remember also negative painting, where you can define an object by painting behind it or around it.